Hello, I'm Alasdair Macleod, and I'm here in Madrid on behalf of the GoldMoney Foundation, and with me is Philipp Bagus, who is the author of this interesting book, The Tragedy of the Euro, a very topical subject, Philipp. I was particularly interested in, you were using the analogy of the tragedy of the commons, which I think very briefly, if I can describe it correctly, is when everybody uses a common facility without regard for its future. And you've interestingly used this as a description as to what some of the countries within the Euro region have been doing since they joined. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. A tragedy of the commons occurs when property rights are not defined well. An example would be fishes in the ocean. No one is the owner, so everyone can fish. So the incentive is to fish as fast as you can, because otherwise the other fishers will fish and have the profits.
While stocks last.
Yeah, yes. so it leads to over-exploitation. And the same happens with the euro. What is exploited there is the purchasing power of the euro, because in a complex way, any government can basically print euros. Well, let me explain this. What governments can do, they cannot print euros, but they can print paper and they write on it government bonds. Then they sell it to the banking system, and the banking system gives it to the ECB as collateral for new loans, and the banks receive new reserves, and on top of these reserves they can expand the money supply, credit expansion. So this is the way that traditionally government deficits are indirectly monetized. The same happens with the Fed. The only difference is that the Fed buys directly the government bonds. It doesn't take it as collateral for new loans. But at the end it's the same. Where the thing in the Eurozone is that not one government can do that. That is finance the expenditures through monetization, through the banking system, but any government can do that. So the incentive is to externalize the costs of your deficits on the users of the currency, but in this case, the users of the currency are not only your citizens, but also the citizens in the rest of the Eurozone. And there's one more point. In analogy to the fishing example, let's imagine that Germany has a deficit of 3% of GDP, and it prints government bonds, it's financed, so the money supply increases, prices rise. And the rest of the Eurozone has a deficit of 10% of GDP. And then let's say that's also financed and prices rise in average in the Eurozone 8%. So then the German government, even though it has a deficit, the real German government spending may actually fall. So you can only profit on cost of our other governments and other people if you have a higher deficit than the rest.
So the whole thing works as an incentive to run a higher and higher deficit, essentially.
Yes.
The other thing that's interesting about this is that one forgets history very much. And you reminded us in this book that some of the countries that joined the Eurozone, actually it was their short-term salvation, because they were already running very, very poor finances. The deficits were too large to sustain, and if they didn't join in, they might have suffered a rather nasty inflationary fate. I thought that was a very interesting point. So that really they've morphed from that into a credit bubble, essentially, which, as you describe it, they had a great incentive to get that credit before anybody else got it, essentially.
Yes.
So how does one deal with this tragedy of the commons? Is there a solution for it?
Well, they knew the incentives from the start. They didn't describe it as a tragedy of the commons as I do. But they wanted to they knew the incentives for it, so they wanted to put a limit on the deficits. Like there's a Stability and Growth Pact, 3% of GDP. It's the same as they do for fishers in the ocean. You put quotas. So every fisher, you have a quota, so many tons of fish you can fish. So they said you can exploit the commons, the euro, and having a deficit until up to 3%. But the problem was that no one is enforcing that. No one is imposing penalties if you fish more than you should, if you have higher deficits. Why? Because governments are judging on themselves. They are their own judges, so they decide, okay, no, in this case we won't impose penalties. And in fact, there have been, I think, more than 80 infringements on the limits of the Stability and Growth Pact, and no one penalty has ever been enforced. So it was a total failure, the Stability and Growth Pact.
Because there were two aspects of it, weren't there? There was the current spending, and also there was the accumulation of government debt. I think was it the Maastricht Treaty that set this up, that that no country could go more than, was it 60%?
60%, yes.
Of GDP, and of course, I mean, they're all over that now, aren't they? Pretty well, except the new entrants, perhaps.
Perhaps, yeah. Well, last year only 2 countries had a deficit lower than 3%. That was Finland and Luxembourg.
Yeah.
And the average of the Eurozone debt per GDP was, I think, 80% or 88%. So, and if 60 is the limit, you see that it did not really work.
And even Germany is over it.
Germany is also over it.
Nearly 80%, aren't they? Or 78% or something?
Yeah, I think it's 78%, and they also infringed several times the 3% deficit. Yeah.
So the tragedy of the commons is
intact.
Is a very interesting. I think it's a very interesting analogy, and it's certainly caught my eye.